Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Security Shorts with Scott. Super excited about this one. We have Doug Miller with Brightworks with us today, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the transformation we're seeing in the MSP space and how operationalizing services is really a big need out in the market. Doug, welcome to the program.
Scott, thanks so much for having me on today. I really am looking forward to our conversation.
Perfect. Well, we always like to put our guests on the spot early, and that can be a variety of ways. So for you, tell us a little bit. How'd you get into the space, or how'd you get into the business?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm one of those kind of internet old guys, right? There's a joke that was going around a few years ago about elders of the internet, and I kind of fall into that. I actually started. My very first computer was, and this will really date me, a Heathkit that my dad and I built. So it was a printed circuit board where we literally had to solder stuff onto it, and it was programmed in assembler. And my first commercial computer was a Commodore PET 2001 with a whopping 4K of RAM.
Yep.
And
Wow.
Kind of the way that I learned, so first of all, we had to program by typing everything in. All software came in books at that point, and you had to put it in. So I learned to program in BASIC when I was 9. But my sort of introduction to computer troubleshooting was my dad and I wanted to upgrade the memory in our PET. So we actually built a little breadboard to expand it from 4K to 16K, right? You know, your watch now has way more memory than this thing had. And because we built this thing from scratch and put it, soldered it onto the motherboard of this PET, we really didn't have the necessary power filtering on it. So every time the compressor for our refrigerator kicked on, it sent enough of a power surge through the home electrical grid that it would crash the computer. So back in my day, right, you were learning to troubleshoot computers by your refrigerator causing them to crash. And that kind of started my career in IT. Eventually, I ended up in a variety of executive positions and consulting positions, and 12 and a half years ago, started my own company, the Brightworks Group.
I love that story. I think a lot of us got our starts on Commodores. So that was the VIC 80, I think, or something like that. Yeah. PET, then the VIC, then the Commodore
20 and,
VIC 20. Yeah. That's what it was. Yep. And then the Commodore 64.
Yep.
Those are that's where we all learn. Take your punchy floppy disk and punch it on the other side so you can get twice as much usage out of it.
Absolutely remember doing that on 3.5-inch drives. Buying my very first hard drive for a Tandy 1500 SE and just all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah.
Those truly are the good old days. So Doug, let's talk about the modern days a little bit. So I love what Brightworks does. Everybody, I think, is probably at least familiar with managed security, managed service providers. But you all take a very different approach to the MSP and what your customers need. So why don't you just give us a sense of what's happening out there in the space when it comes to supporting your customers?
Yeah, I come from really an operations background. My history across multiple industries and multiple careers has been about operations, and we very much look at things from an operations perspective. There's a great book out there that's concerned with IT service management and operations that is called the Visible Ops Handbook, and we really sort of glommed onto that years ago. And our view of the world is a very operations-centric view. We talk about, we do the stuff that nobody else really wants to do, right? It's kind of the boring stuff, but it keeps everything running. And until you're doing that, it's a little bit like making sure that you're doing maintenance on your car, right? It's changing the oil every 5,000 miles, 10,000 miles now in a lot of cases is not exciting, but well, you better do it, right? Or you have a problem. And so our approach is to look at all of the things that our combined well over 100 years plus of IT experience tells us are the things that are critical to keeping an organization running. Part of my background is in healthcare IT. I ran the data centers for a level 1 trauma center, regional burn center. And you know, you don't get outages. You're not allowed to have them. You have to stay up and running. And so being focused on how do we routinize, how do we proceduralize the day-to-day processes and execute them regularly, whether that's in infrastructure, security operations, whatever, means that you're proactively addressing these things and stopping problems before they happen, right? Documenting everything and not just picking a service, putting it in place and going, well, it'll run, right? My background was also very heavily in backup and disaster recovery, particularly for like healthcare. And, you know, that's one of the places where things tend to fall apart for a lot of organizations is they put it in place, but they don't test it.
They don't maintain
it.
Yep.
Check it every day. They don't. And we're built around making sure that we put those kinds of things in place, as well as building infrastructures and systems projects for our customers that have those kind of pieces, right?
Yep.
So that's what drives a lot of people to us is they're tired of having the unexpected happen. We're all about trying to eliminate the unexpected.
Yeah, we have a joke that you want to see somebody's eyes roll back in the back of their head, talk about the concept of operations when it comes to security programs. And, you know, we spent, same thing like you, we've been doing security forever. And this concept of running the program is where almost everybody falls down. Sure, you can buy tools, you can get people, but that day-to-day grind of running this thing in a consistent manner that is always getting better, getting ahead of the problem, doing the right things is where almost every company falls down. But it is literally the least sexy thing to talk about. Like they want to talk about bad guys and how do you attack them and how you kick them out and how do you respond and all this stuff. When you say, oh, that's great, but by the way, let's talk about your concept of operations. And they're like, do we have to?
yeah. Nobody wants to talk about that stuff. Nobody wants to document that stuff.
Yep.
And yet, if you don't do it, right, that's where you're creating the opportunity.
That's exactly it. That's that gap, right? That gets exploited. So let's talk about that because, I spent most of my career with the Fortune 100, Fortune 500. They get this concept. Right. Some of them do it well. Some of them don't do it well. But in the mid-market, sometimes you see companies that care. Sometimes you see a lot of companies that do not care. What's sort of your take on what's happening in the mid-market when it comes to sort of improving this consistency of execution across both their IT service management components, but also their security pieces?
Yeah, and we are seeing it. It's an interesting trend, right? You're dead on, right? For years, it was a very difficult conversation to have in the mid-market because they didn't care. I can remember times where we would sit down to talk with people and they would be like, look, we're just going to go ahead and pay, if something happens, we'll pay the ransom or whatever because it's less expensive than doing anything about it. What's evolved, though, is that the penalties for this, in terms of business interruption, in terms of reputational damage, which is a big one that we see these days, have become so costly that it now is a concern in the C-suite. Now, they're still utterly uninterested in the details, right? And Yeah, if we have IT and security people listening to us, I'm sure that they run into this all the time, and it's one of their frustrations is, we try and explain this stuff, and the C-suite doesn't want to hear it. They really want to reduce it to dollars and cents. And that's a real key piece of understanding this is you've got to focus on impact to the business and how you're going to help the business.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that we did when we first started was we were very focused on organizations that were highly regulated, that were subject to some kind of compliance. And we did that because, frankly, they have a gun to their head, right? They can't ignore it. And so we would focus on those companies because it made the discussion a lot easier. One of the big things we're seeing today is that the change in how insurance companies are approaching insuring their customers, especially mid-market firms, is driving a level of interest in this that we never saw before. It's becoming like everybody is a highly regulated firm. They don't care how. They just want to be able to attest to the things that they need to attest to and say they can do it, right? Which they then turn around, the C-suite turns around and dumps on their IT and security personnel and says, make sure these things are taken care of.
Yep.
Unfortunately, often the staff in mid-market companies, they number one, don't have the personnel. They often don't have the experience and the knowledge. And getting back to our original point, they often don't have the operational framework to do this.
Yep.
Nor is it necessarily the best use of their time in terms of driving the company.
And you hit so many good things there. We continue to see compliance, small c compliance coming down, whether or not that's the questionnaires coming out of insurance. You're seeing it in the SEC announcement for publicly traded companies.
Yep.
You're going to see it in CMMC. You're already seeing it sort of loosely applied there, obviously not fully implemented, but that's coming. And so the mid-market, for better or for worse, is going to have to address some of these challenges when it comes to an operational approach to running their business, which they do for making their widget, whether or not that's a service or a product, right. They do it there. But when it comes to definitely like security, there's still oftentimes a tools approach. If I just, I just got to buy that tool, implement the tool, and then I can go back to the gazillion other things that they're responsible for. And so how do you sort of see, obviously we work a lot together, but how do you sort of see this approach happening when it comes to security? Because we still see a lot of people thinking that a tools approach is the right approach versus what we view obviously as a security programmatic approach.
Right. Yeah. And it's exactly the same thing. Like I said, the benefit of being around forever is that you see these sort of trends go through the industry. And it's the same problem that we've seen forever with backups, right? And disaster recovery is, I bought Veritas or whatever, and I put it in place. And what do you mean? Now that I need to do a recovery that I haven't been getting backups for 6 months and nothing's current. And that's the problem with a tools-oriented approach is I put it in place, it's running. I remember, again, it's well over 15 years ago, a situation where a hospital called me one day and said, hey, we thought we were getting backups because we weren't getting any emails telling us we weren't. And now it turns out that we weren't, and we destroyed our ERP system and we don't have backups. Can you help? We see the exact same kind of thing happening in security, where, well, look, if I just go buy a thing, it's going to run, and it's not shooting me alerts. Or it's shooting me, and this is often typically the problem with security tools is they don't know how to configure, because they have no operational framework, they don't know how to configure the alerts. So the alerts are a fire hose, and they can't sort through them. They can't separate the wheat from the chaff. And they literally, I mean, this is just mind-boggling to me, but they will set up email filters so that all the security alerts are going into a folder so they don't have to look at them in their inbox, which means you might as well have not bought the tool, right? And unfortunately, what we see driving a desire to change their approach is, for the lucky firms, it's because the small C compliance has put enough pressure on them. For the unlucky firms, it's because they had an event.
Yep.
Right. And they sit back and they go, okay, we got to do something about this. And it's too late, you know?
Doug, I just literally posted something on LinkedIn. There is amazingly a bit of a cavalier attitude sometimes in the mid-market about being breached. Yeah. And I equated it to getting your car towed. It's not just the $350 in cash that you have to pay. It's the process. It's your car's held hostage. It's going down somewhere in the weird hours of the day to an un-CD, to a CD part of the whole entire process is just incredibly unpleasant. And so this concept of, well, we'll just get breached, or we'll roll the dice this year. It's something that companies really need to try to get ahead of, and versus the view of like, oh, we'll just pay the money. And again, to your point, you're starting to see some movement there. We're hearing companies are looking to decrease the point solution. So we know vendor consolidation always happens inside of an economic, either flatline or downtrend or whatever we're in right now. What are you sort of seeing out there when it comes to the choices customers are making about who they're using for their products and their services?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. You're right? Budgets have gone flat or decreasing in the security space. Companies that are fortunate enough to have CISOs are concerned about that. Mid-market companies that don't have CISOs but do have IT teams are getting that response from the C-suite of, well, we're just not going to spend as much this year. The other thing that's driving this, I think, is there is a lot of vendor consolidation, right? And we see a lot of confusion in IT teams, security teams. They don't know who to select for that tool because they don't know what's going to happen, right? Yeah, this guy looks good today, but is he going to get bought? And is he going to become part of another larger thing that I don't want to be part of, right? So with the constant pace of mergers and acquisitions combined with the budget thing, it's confusing people. They don't really know what choices to make. And so there is a tendency to, from the IT director, VP of IT perspective, to really want to find a solution that eliminates all these different vendors so they don't have to try and juggle that takes the decision making off of them about who to select. Right? Like you guys know, you spend all your time in it, is what we hear. You get who all the vendors are and what the intelligence is and what's going to happen. And there's a starting to be a realization that just looking at the speeds and feeds, Sentinel-1 detects 0.2% more than this guy over here, is a very narrow way of looking at it. They start to realize, hey, I got to worry about what's the relationship going to be like? Are they going to get acquired by somebody, and development's essentially going to stop because a PE firm bought them and nobody wants to throw money at it? And so we're increasingly getting these customers coming to us and saying, look, I got cyber insurance renewal coming up. They've asked us to fill out this questionnaire. There's stuff that we're not doing on here. We don't want to add a bunch of vendors. Is there a way you guys can simplify our security program? Because it's complex for us to manage, and frankly, we don't have the people to manage it anyway.
Yep. Yeah, I love that. We obviously, that's the area we play, but we continue to see that as well, which is even if they can, we're talking with some really actually relatively large companies right now that have the people, the tools, the processes. But even they're like, it's just not worth our time to try to run a global security program anymore. It's too hard. It's too difficult. Too many vendors. Too many things changing. Not a good use of our people's time. People are expensive. And so this process of saying, how do you get an outcome versus buy a tool?
Yeah,
is something that we're seeing a lot, seeing that happen a lot in conversations these days.
I think that's the realization, right? Is that we're after an outcome. We want to be secure, not the sort of propeller head, I've got a fascination with this particular vendor and tool kind of thing. Can't rule the roost anymore. It's too difficult. So even frankly, some of the guys that are more propeller head driven are kind of backing away from that.
Well, Doug, and I think that's why probably executives come to you more than because we do run into it on our side in the mid-tier. The example I use all the time was I used to have 1,000 Dell servers and I used to have a bunch of engineers and we had a bunch of software and we had orchestration. And when you tell them that's moving to the cloud, they're like, no, I want to play with all the software and the tools and the servers. It's the same in the security space. A lot of the mid-level senior security people still want to play with the toys, the tools. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it makes no sense for a company to be running a security program when that's not core to their business, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And it's been interesting, right? I mean, we have seen people who definitely fall into that. I like to play with the tools space. And they've come to us and they've been like, hey, look, we installed Splunk and we blah, 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 did all this stuff. And it was really cool. But then we started seeing what the volume alerts was going to be like and what it was actually going to be like to run this thing versus the setup. The setup and configuration was interesting. I love to do that from a propeller perspective.
Right.
But monitoring it and realizing that this stuff is going to be coming in 24/7 and that I might have to deal with it on nights and weekends. I'm not so sure I'm excited about that, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
So we hear that, and we definitely hear from the execs, right, who say, "Look, I just want it to work."
Right. Yep.
I want to be able to attest to this stuff and check the boxes, and knock the cost of my cyber liability insurance down without having to jump through a bunch of hoops.
That's it. And preferably connected to my cyber insurance. So connect my security program to my cyber insurance program so that that process becomes less expensive and easier to manage.
Right. The more there can be an integration between those two things, the more strategic it is for the company, because then it just happens.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Right. And they can very clearly, visibly see my efforts over here, the money I invested over here is earning me a return over here, not just in preventing a breach, but in reducing the cost of my ongoing expense.
That's right.
That's key for executives.
100%. Doug, listen, as always, I appreciate your insights, the understanding you have of the market, obviously the sort of a view that you've seen change over time. Is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with as we sort of wrap up this Security Shorts?
Yeah, just in general, I think this overall approach of not being, unfortunately in the market today, there's all this fear-based marketing, right? If you don't do this, terrible things are going to happen. And that often drives people to that tools approach. Well, let's get a thing that'll keep me from doing that. This is a business and risk mitigation decision. Approach it from that perspective and think about what's best for the business in terms of what's going to help them grow strategically, achieve their mission, and optimize their expense versus the knee-jerk, oh God, I gotta do something because some vendor came in here yesterday and told me that if I didn't do it, he ran a test and showed me how I could get hacked.
Right.
right?
Yep.
That's not the right time to be making a decision. This is an operational and strategic decision. Think about it that way.
Love that. Great advice. So with that, everyone, as always, thank you for joining another Security Shorts with Scott. Thank you to our guest today, Doug from Brightworks, the founder and CEO. We appreciate everybody joining. We'll have another one out shortly, so please subscribe and stay in contact with SolCyber and with Brightworks. Thank you very much.